Hello everyone, and welcome to the second Idle Game Maker lesson in which I will teach you how to reposition elements like buttons, resources, and even entire layout boxes. So this is what the finished product of this lesson will look like. In the middle we have two big buttons next to each other, and on the bottom we have our resources, and below those resources are some more buttons, and I will also teach you how to add a box containing buttons above your store. And as a little bonus, it's also scrollable. As you can see here, there are 5 buttons in there, and you can add however many as you like. So let's just jump right into it. Now, before we dive directly into coding, you first need to learn a little bit of CSS theory so that you don't get lost in the process. So, element repositioning is done with CSS, and this stands for cascading style sheets. Now, CSS in a broader term is used to style HTML elements, and in Idle Game Maker your HTML elements are things and layout boxes. Now, the necessary knowledge that you will need in order to reposition elements, first thing you need to know is basic CSS positioning properties and syntax, which I will all explain. You also need to know the difference between positioning using pixel measurement and percentage measurements, and you also need to know that elements are moved relative to the size of the layout box that they are contained in, and this is known as relative positioning, but we will also get back to this in just a second. So let's now move on to some basic CSS syntax, and this will be regarding layout boxes, which we will be moving and repositioning a lot throughout this lesson. So CSS code needs to be declared in the CSS section, obviously, and layout boxes can be moved and resized using the hashtag box dash keyword and then appending the layout box thing key to that keyword, and this is also known as a selector. Basically, you are selecting which element to style. Now, of course, obviously, start of CSS code needs to be marked with a right-facing curly bracket, and the end of CSS code needs to be marked with a left-facing curly bracket, so make sure you do not mix them up, because otherwise your code will not work. Now, CSS lines of code need to end with a semicolon as well, so make sure to remember that too. And here we have an example of a box having its width and its height set by the syntax which we have explained. So here we have the CSS section, here we have the keyword, and here we have the thing key of our layout box. Here we have our right-facing curly bracket, which indicates the start of our code, and here we can set some properties for the layout box to have, and then the left-facing curly bracket for the end of the code. Now let's move on to CSS classes. So, custom CSS classes are declared with a dot in the CSS section with a name appended to it, and the CSS classes can be then assigned to any type of thing in Idle Game Maker, which will then inherit the assigned classes properties. So you could assign a CSS class to an upgrade, a resource, a building, an achievement, even a layout box, basically whatever you want. But classes have a key disadvantage, and that is classes sometimes cannot override other inherited properties from an existing style sheet, most usually position, and this is the main reason classes should be mainly used for styling but not for repositioning. Here we also have an example of a class. So here we created a new class with a dot, named it orange. We have a right-facing curly bracket indicating the start of our code. Then we have the background property with its value here. This is the hexadecimal code for the color orange, and then the left-facing curly bracket, which indicates the end of our CSS code. That basically creates a custom CSS class for us to use, which we can then append to any type of thing. In this example, I appended it to a resource. Here you can see that this resource has the class orange. This is the result of how that resource will look like in game. So you can see that it's orange compared to the default blue. So with classes covered, let's move on to teaching you the main 4 positioning properties and measurement types. So the main 4 positioning properties in CSS are top, bottom, right, and left. Of course, you assign a value to these properties as shown by this X here, and keep note that X can be in pixels or in percentages. Now I will explain this in just a second. But first, what do these properties actually do? Well, these properties set how far away the element should be from the specified side of a box that it is contained in. Now, if an element isn't contained in any box, it will be moved away from the specified side of the screen, and this is what is known as relative positioning. Now, I know that this sounds probably very confusing, but don't worry, once we get into coding it, it will be a lot clearer. So for example, the top 50 pixel property would position the element 50 pixels away from the top of the box it is contained in, or 50 pixels away from the top of the screen if it isn't contained in any box. And here we have a percentage measurement, so if we did write 5% instead of 50 pixels, it would position the element 5% of the box's width away from the right side of the box that it is contained in, or 5% of the screen's width away from the right side of the screen if it isn't contained in any box. Hopefully that makes sense. And also very important is that percentage measurements scale with zooming in or out. You have no idea how many Idle Game Maker games I have seen with custom CSS and their layout just completely broke as soon as I zoomed in or zoomed out because they used constant pixel measurements instead of percentage measurements. So just remember, pixel measurements are constant, percentage measurements scale with the screen size. Alright, and yeah, that should be pretty much it for the CSS theory. Right now I just want to share some final tips with you that should hopefully help you on your journey of learning CSS, and after this we can begin coding. So the first tip is that any property that accepts pixels also accepts percentages. And using percentages as a measurement is most of the time better as it scales with screen size. Now you can also find CSS properties and an overall guide at this website, which is also linked in the description. And another very useful tip is that right-clicking an element, then clicking inspect element allows you to style or reposition that single element in real time. Also important to remember is that incorrect CSS code in Idle Game Maker doesn't throw an error, so make sure you don't miss any typos. Okay, so we are in Pastebin and I have already created a template game for us to use. At the moment it looks a little bit like this. It's just the classic default game layout with a few buttons and a few resources. And our first task will be to move the buttons below the resources and then move both the resources and the buttons to the bottom of the screen. However, for this we will need to import the default game's layout into our code so that we can change the position of the layout boxes through CSS. And the way we do this is pretty simple. It's actually listed in the handbook. If you go at the beginning of the handbook, you just scroll down to the layout section of the handbook, and here you can see the use default, and this is the default layout of Idle Game Maker. So we are gonna copy and paste this, right? So copy and then paste it into the layout section in our game. And there we go. Now this won't change anything in our game because this kind of was already there, but now that we have it copied and pasted here, we can refer to these individual boxes by their thing keys in CSS, and then we can change their position. So let's save our changes. Okay, so before we actually start writing any CSS code, I wanted to show you that you can move the boxes already through inspect element. However, it won't save, but that's fine because we can kind of get a feel for how it will move. So when we right click on this button, or any kind of button really, and click inspect element, we can see the individual button here, right? You can see that it highlights it on the screen for us, but we are not looking for the button. In our layout we can see that buttons, right, are contained in the buttons box, and that buttons box is actually right here. You can see its dimensions, it's highlighted, right? And if we were to change some values here, for example top 100 pixels, if we were to do that, you can see that it moved 100 pixels away from the top. And you can also see that this box is in the box main, which will be important later, but for now just know that you can reposition boxes like this as well in real time. However, of course it won't save if you hit refresh, so you should kind of just use this as a guide to what kind of values you like and what you should plug in the CSS code that we will use later. So when we hit refresh, it will reset back to normal. Alright, so now with that one small tip shown, let's actually show you how to move it and have it always be saved, right? So we just go to edit, and if you paid attention to my presentation there, you know that in the CSS section we need to use the hashtag box and dash keyword for this, right? And then append the thing key of the box, which means hashtag box dash buttons. Right now we put in a right facing curly bracket and just add in top 100 pixels, and then the left facing curly bracket so that the code ends. Now when we click save changes, we can see that the buttons moved below. However, this is what I wanted to show you by saying that you almost never should use pixel measurements. There are a few cases where they are useful, but in this case they are not, because when I zoom out, right, you can see that they are once again above the resources, and we do not want this. Now there are actually two kind of ways to fix this problem, and one way is that you would just plug in percentage values, for example 5%, 6%, 7%, 8% or so on, and you would just kind of see which one you like, right? But if you want a more methodical approach to this, you could find out how far away the resources are from the top of the screen and then base your position of buttons off of that. So let's click inspect element on the resources, and when we look into our layout here, we can see that resources are contained in the box called res. So when we go into here, we can see that this is the box res, and we can see that the resources are actually 5% of the screen's height away from the top. So I think that a value of around 9% would work nicely for our buttons. So let's save our changes, hit refresh, and there we go. Now this might not seem that much of a difference, however when we now zoom out, they will always be contained below the resources. So now for our next task, we want to move both the resources and the buttons down to the bottom of the screen at the same time. This is actually pretty simple, because if we look inside of our layout, we can see that the main box contains both the resources box and the buttons box, which means if we move the main box down, the resources box and the buttons box will move down relative to the main box, right? And we can quickly show this using inspect element. So let's click inspect element on, for example, a resource. Let's find the main box in the game, and we can see that it's in here. And let's try moving it about 80% of the screen's height away from the top. All right, and there we go. So we can see that the main box has been moved to the bottom and the buttons and resources with it. However, we have a new problem, and that is that the buttons are now below the resources. And well, why is that, you might ask? Well, this is due to relative positioning. Since we moved the main box 80% of the screen's height away from the top, the main box's height decreased by about 80% as well. As you can see when it's highlighted, its height is a lot lower than it was previously. And since the buttons box is contained inside of the main box, and we set the top property value in the buttons box a value of 9%, that means having the buttons be 9% of the main box's height away from the top is no longer enough. We will have to increase it to probably about 25% or so. Let's get back into our code. Of course, first let's hit refresh so that we see the changes that occurred, and let's go back to our code, hit edit, and let's change the box buttons to be top 25%. And now let's also move the main box as well by about 80% away from the top. So let's save our changes, get back into our game, hit refresh, and we can see that it moved very nicely in our game. And when we zoom out or zoom in, it should pretty much always be below the resources. Alright, and that's our first task finished. Congratulations on getting this far, and hopefully now you are kind of starting to grasp the basics of repositioning in CSS. So our second task will be to add two big buttons which are next to each other in the middle of the screen, which means we need to do something that looks a little bit like this. If we just resize these buttons, there we go. And basically we want to add these kind of functional buttons into the middle of our screen that are next to each other. So without further ado, let's get to completing the second task. So now if you're a bit more familiar with Idle Game Maker, you'd know that in order to create a bigger button in the center of the screen, you would need to add the big button class to it, and you'd be right. However, that wouldn't work now because buttons are contained inside this button box, which we moved to the bottom, which means the big button will need to be contained, or rather the two big buttons will need to be contained in separate boxes. Now, just to show you what I mean by this, I have actually created a big button in my game with the big button class attached, of course, and also an icon so we can see it easier. So this is what it will look like, right? It's in the buttons box in the middle, and it's not in the middle of the screen, it's in the middle of the buttons box. So we will need to create a new layout box in our layout section. Let's call it, for example, right button box, because I want this specific button to be on the right. And of course we need to add a tag to our big button. So let's add the tag right button because it's going to be on the right side of the screen. And then let's have the new box that we created contain that tag, which means it will contain only that element. now when we click Save Changes and hit refresh, it should be on the top of the screen because we haven't set the layout box's position yet. Okay, so now that we have our button in the neutral position, we want to move it around right about here and then a little bit more to the left as well. So this distance here I believe should be around 40% of the screen's height, and this probably around 5% or so. However, there's one more thing you need to realize, that is that the button is actually already 50% of the screen's width away from the left, right? And this is actually set by the big button class which we attached to the button. So in order to move the button 5% more to the left, we need to actually add right 5% into the CSS of the box that the button is contained in, because if you do right 5%, it kind of subtracts 5% from the left value set by the big button class. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's get into implementing this. So we need to once again select the box we want to move, and that should be this right button box right here. Of course, don't forget the brackets. And so we wanted to move it 40% away from the top and 5% away from the right. Now again, this is a case of relative positioning because the position is already set by the big button class. So let's save our changes, and now when I hit refresh, the button should be around in this position somewhere. So let's hit refresh, and there we go, it's right here, pretty much where we want it. Seems like it's centered pretty nicely. So we have successfully implemented one button that is centered and is to the right side of the screen. However, we wanted two, and our next one should be right next to this one, but a little somewhere around here. So let's quickly do that. Let's create a new button that is pretty much identical to this big button that we have already created. Of course, let's give it a tag of a left button, and don't forget to change the thing key. Next up, we are going to need to create a new box which will contain that button. So it's going to be identical to this one with just a different name. So let's have this button box be called left button box and have it contain the tag left button, which means it will contain this new big button that we have created. So let's save our changes, hit refresh, and it should be in the neutral position ready to be moved. So now let's move the button in a similar fashion like we did before. So real quick, let's just go in the CSS section, select the left button box, right? Of course, don't forget the brackets, and we want it to be 40% away from the top, the same as the right button box, and I think a right value of 35% would be pretty much perfect. That means it would be about 15% away from the left. So let's hit refresh, and there we go. So we have two big buttons right next to each other. They are pretty much centered. They don't go out of the screen when we resize them. And yeah, that's basically the second task done. Congratulations. Now for our final task, we are gonna want to make some space to have a little button section above our store. Now this is gonna be a little bit more difficult to do, but I will try my best to explain it. So first things first, we will need to make some space for the new layout box which we will put here, which will contain some buttons. And the way we do that is by moving this entire store down a little bit, right? Similar to how we did with the main box for the resources and these buttons here. So when we go back into our layout, we can see that the store contains buildings and the upgrades, and that's basically this entire tab right here. So when we click inspect element and find the store box, should be right here, yep, you can see that its width is 40%, and that if we move it 40 pixels down, we have made some space for our new buttons, which will be located here. Okay, but obviously that won't save when we hit refresh, as you can see. So let's actually implement that into our code. So we are gonna need to select the store box, and this is pretty simple. You just move it 40 pixels away from the top. Now you could use percentages for this, but I'd prefer for it to just stay pixels because it doesn't really matter if this doesn't scale with zooming in or out. So let's save our changes, and we can see that the store is now permanently 40 pixels away from the top of the screen. So now that we made space for the new box, which will be in here, right, we need to kind of think a little bit about the dimensions of the box and the position of the box as well. So we know that this distance here is 40 pixels, right? And this length here, we figured out before that it's 40%. Okay, so we know that the box which we will create needs to have a width of 40% and a height of 40 pixels, and it also needs to be 60% away from the left, right, so that it fits snugly inside of here. So let's get to actually creating that box. So let's create a new box inside of right about here. Let's just call it special buttons, right? Have it contain tag special button, and we of course need to create a new button for this. So let's have this be special button 1 and give it a tag of special button, and we also want to give it a name as well. Of course, don't forget to indent your code, and let's give it a name of special button 1. Now, however, we need to actually set the dimensions of our layout box and the position of it as well. So we have created this special buttons box. Let's select it once again inside of the CSS. So it's called special buttons. So we want it to have a width of 40% and a height of 40 pixels. And we also want it to be 60% away from the left side of the screen. So let's save our changes now, and hopefully there should be a button above our store. Oh right, whoops, I forgot to add the contains. I only put in contain, right? So watch out for all of these typos. So let's hit refresh again, and yeah, we can see that we now have a button above our store. Alright, so we did add a box above our store, and that also contains special buttons with the tag special button. However, it looks pretty ugly right now. There's this weird ugly gap here, so right now let's fill it with the color that we have here, this blue kind of color. And the way we find that actually is by once again clicking inspect element and going into, for example, a header, right? And we can see that it has a background of this color. So we just want to copy and paste this hexadecimal code for our color and add a background into our special buttons box, which is above the store, and just copy and paste that color there. And now the background of that box should be identical to basically this blue color right here. So when we hit refresh, close this, yeah, we can see that it has this. Now it doesn't look as pretty because these headers and everything actually have box shadows. However, I won't bother with adding box shadows in this episode. That's a topic for a different video. But right now, at least there's not the ugly gap that there was before. So we are basically halfway done with this task, but there are a few things I want to change. For example, I want every single button, right, to cover exactly 1/3 of the layout's width, right? And also one more problem that is here is that they are centered right now, so I want them to be pushed to the left and appear from the left instead of the center. And there is one more problem that's a bit more hidden, and that is if you zoom in, the buttons do not fit into their box. So let's fix these problems one by one. So the first thing I should tell you is that since we are not repositioning anything anymore, nor are we really playing with boxes, we are more so playing with the elements inside that box, right? We want to style them. We should use a class for this. And if you remember at the beginning of a video, I told you that you declare a class with a dot in the CSS and then naming that class whatever you want. So I'm gonna name this class just special, and we are gonna be assigning this class to every single button that we create inside of here. Now, of course, this class rather, will need to have a few properties. So first things first, I want these buttons to be pushed to the left. And for this, we need to go on this website because it has a lot of useful properties. And this is actually a very good website for learning CSS. I have it linked in the description. But for this, we need the float property as is listed here. And as it says here, the CSS float property specifies how an element should float. So basically this is an element that has a float value of left, and this is an element that has a float value of right. Now I want my buttons to be floating left, which means I will add the float property with the value of left. So in our special class, let's add float left and assign this class to basically every single one of our buttons, right? Of our special buttons rather. So class and special, there we go. Hit enter. So there's a space between them, improves readability. And there we go. Now let's just save our changes and let's see what happens with this. And we can see that the buttons are being created from the left side now. So that's one problem fixed, but we still have a few more. So next thing that I want to change is to have these buttons cover exactly 1/3 of the box size, right? And you might think that, oh, well, just set the width to be 33.33333 or whatever, you know, percent. And you'd be partially correct. However, there is one problem right now, and that is that there is a small gap, as you can see here, between these boxes, and that will mess up our measurements by a little bit. So we need to remove this gap, and this is actually called a margin in CSS. If you want to, you can read a little bit about it here, right? And it's basically the gap between elements inside a box. So let's have the margin in here be 0 pixels and have the width be 33.333 just percent, and hopefully this should work. And yeah, we can see that the buttons cover 1/3 of the box size, right? But they do not fit inside of the box anymore after we add more than 3. So a very simple fix for this sort of problem where your elements do not fit inside of a box that you set is to add the overflow property into your box which contains these elements. And as it says here, the CSS overflow property controls what happens to content that is too big to fit into an area. Now the overflow property has quite a few values that you could use, but for now we're just gonna focus on the auto value for this property because it's gonna be very convenient for us to use. So inside of our box, right, now this applies to the box, not the class, so don't confuse it. And in our box we just add overflow auto, and this should add a nice little scroll bar into our box for when stuff like this happens where the elements don't fit. So let's hit refresh, and yeah, we can see that now we have a scroll bar, and yeah, this is great. However, there is one more problem that I'm seeing, and that is that these buttons are actually of incorrect height. So this is a very simple fix. You just add a height of 40 pixels into our class. There we go, a height of 40 pixels. Save our changes, and now it should be pretty much perfect. Yeah, we can see that they fit very nicely inside of the box, and you can also scroll and add however many buttons that you like into this little menu that we made. Alright, and that should be the end of this lesson. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you found it useful and at least learned some of the basics of repositioning using CSS. And keep in mind that the methods or the techniques that I taught you in this video are actually very flexible, so you can use them on any type of element in your game, any kind of box that you create. And yeah, make sure to like, comment and subscribe, and if you really enjoy what I do here, feel free to check out my Patreon, link is in the description, and for only $2 a month I can shout you out at the end of all my future videos. So once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.